So, we are going to be starting on the Escape from Furnace series, and this one is called Lockdown. This is the first book of this series. I read the first chapter just to kind of see what it was about, and I'll give you a heads up. If you are a very visual reader and have really good imagination, this might not be the book for you, just because the first chapter all by itself was pretty imaginary. It's a very good book, a very fast-paced book, as you'll find out. For our little one and all the other lost children, always remembered, always loved, always free. No way out. If I stopped running, I was dead. My lungs were on fire, my heart pumping acid, every muscle in my body threatening to cramp. I couldn't even see where I was going anymore, my vision fading as my body prepared to give in. If the siren hadn't been hammering at my eardrums, then I'd have been able to hear my breaths, ragged and desperate, unable to pull in enough air to keep me going. Just one more flight of stairs, one more, and I might make it. I forced myself to run faster, the metal staircase rattling beneath my clumsy steps. Everywhere around me, other kids were panicking, all bolting the same way to safety. I didn't look back to see what was behind us. I didn't need to. I could picture it in my head, its demonic muzzle, silver eyes, and those teeth, like razor wire. Someone grabbed my arm, pulling me back. I lost my balance, spilling over the railing. For a second, the yard appeared 5 stories beneath me, and I almost let myself go. Better this way than to be devoured, right? Then the beast shrieked through its wet throat, and I started running again before I even knew I was doing it. I heard the rattle of the cell doors, knew they were closing. If I was caught out here, then I was history. I leaped up the last few steps, hurtling down the narrow landing. The inmates jeered from their cells, shouting for me to die. They stuck out their arms and legs to trip me, and it almost worked. I staggered, lurched forward, falling. Somehow, I made it. Swinging through the door an instant before it slammed shut, the mechanism locking tight. The creature howled, a banshee's wail that made my skin crawl. I risked looking back through the bars, saw its huge bulk bounding past my cell, no skin to hide its grotesque muscles. There was a scream as it found another victim, but it didn't matter. I was safe, for now. "That was close," said a voice behind me. "You're getting good at this." I didn't answer, just stared out across the prison. 6 stories of cells beneath me, and God only knew how many more above my head, all buried deep underground. I felt like the weight of the world was pressing down on me, like I'd been buried alive, and the panic began to set in. I closed my eyes, sucking to hell. I can tell you the exact moment that my life went to hell. I was 12, 2 years ago now, and there was trouble at school. No surprise there. I came from a rough part of town, and everybody wanted to be a gangster. Each lunchtime, the playing field became a battleground for the various groups of friends. Most of the war was fought with words. We'd call each other names. We'd tell one gang to move out of our area. We had control of the jungle gym, and we weren't going to give it up. I didn't realize until much later just how like a prison school could be. Every now and again, something would kick off and fists would start flying. I never threw a punch in all my time at school. Even the thought of it makes me feel queasy. But that doesn't make me any better than the boys and girls who got their hands dirty. It makes me worse. At least fighting with your own 2 fists is kind of noble. That Tuesday started off like a normal day. I had no idea that it was the beginning of the end, my first step on the road to hell. Me and Johnny and Scud had been sitting on the jungle gym, talking about soccer and about who'd been the best English keeper of all time. It was one of those days where everything just seemed like it was perfect. You know, a blue sky that goes on forever, and so warm that it feels like the sun's wrapped you up in a blanket. When I think back to my life before it turned, I think about this day. I think about how things could have been different if I'd just walked away. But I didn't walk away when Toby and Brandon dragged this little kid across the playground. I didn't walk away when they started pushing and shoving him and asking him questions about why his daddy drove him to school in a Range Rover. I didn't walk away when Toby threw the first punch and the kid crumpled. I didn't walk away when Brandon dug the kid's wallet from his pocket and threw it at me. Instead, I opened that wallet, took out 2 10-pound notes and crammed them into my pocket. Then I turned my back on the sound of muffled punches and thought about what I'd buy. That was the exact moment my life went to hell. Always trust your instincts, Alex, was something my dad used to say. He was no stranger to trouble. Nothing serious, but a couple of dodgy business deals that hadn't gone the way he'd wanted. A good man, if a little lost, and not the sort of person qualified to give you advice like that. But he was right. Your instincts are there for a reason, and on the day that I walked out of school with Daniel Richards' 20 quid, they were screaming for me to find that little kid and give it back. You can probably guess by now that I didn't. No, I learned to ignore my instincts, to switch off the little voice that tells you not to do things, to deny the fact that I hated myself for what I was doing. And that's how I became a criminal. The thing is, it was so easy. It started off with me, Toby, and Brandon walking around the playground, demanding money from the other kids. The kind of thing you always see in films just before the big, ugly bully got his comeuppance. Only I was thin and scrawny, not bad-looking, and I didn't get my comeuppance for another 2 years. Loose change, a fiver every now and again, and occasionally some candy. It wasn't enough. When Toby suggested we break into a house or two, Brandon backed out. I didn't. Greed wouldn't let me. So we did. We hit a small bungalow 3 roads over from my house, one we knew was empty for the night. Around 300 quid stuffed in a fake can, and a bundle of jewelry that we chickened out of selling and ended up throwing them in the trash. I still haven't forgotten the old lady who lived there, glimpsed with a long-dead husband in the faded photographs on the mantelpiece, and the knowledge that those rings meant more to her than any amount of money. But I buried my doubts just like I buried all my other uncomfortable thoughts. Committing any crime can be easy if you don't think about it. And I never thought about the future, not once. Even though everybody was talking about the tougher police forces, even though there was zero tolerance on youth crime after the so-called Summer of Slaughter, when the gangs went on killing sprees, even though they'd built the Furnace Penitentiary, the toughest maximum security prison in the world for young offenders, the place that would swallow you whole if you were ever unlucky enough to walk through its doors. I remember the shivers that went up my spine when I first saw pictures of Furnace on TV, but I never once thought I'd end up there. Not me. Of course, I knew I couldn't go on like this forever, but so long as the money kept coming in, I managed to convince myself that I was invincible, that nothing would ever happen to me. On my 13th birthday, I bought myself a new bike. On my 14th, a top-of-the-line computer. I was king of the world and nobody could stop me. But all those dark, horrible feelings I'd buried were still there. I could feel them churning and growing somewhere inside of me. Deep down, I knew I was heading for a fall, one that I'd never be able to pick myself up from. And, as in all good crime movies, that fall came with one last job. One last job. The house was empty. We knew it. Toby had been tipped off by a friend of a friend that the owners were away for the week, leaving behind enough electronic equipment to entertain a small country and a massive bundle of cash from their coffee shop business. But we were waiting outside just in case, cowering under a small bush in the back garden with only a solid wall of rain between us and a set of big windows. "Come on, Alex," muttered Toby, wiping water from his face. "It's emptier than Elvis's coffin in there." Toby had a thing for Elvis. He loved his music so much that he refused to believe the king was dead. I ignored the comment and scanned the back of the house. The lights were all off and we hadn't seen a single movement from inside for the half hour we'd been there. Toby was right. It was probably empty, but the last thing I wanted was to run into some furious guy who'd decided to stay home. It had happened once before when we'd hit a large house out in the countryside, and I'd come face to face with a man on the way to the toilet. We'd both stared at each other in shock for what seemed like hours, then screamed in perfect harmony. I'd turned and legged it with him on my tail. He was even scarier than it sounds. He had been stark naked. Fortunately, nothing like that had happened since, but I was eager to avoid any more encounters with homeowners, clothed or not. Sorry. Toby nudged me and I nodded, feeling a trickle of cold water slide down my back. We were sheltered from the worst of the downpour by the bush, but every now and again drips would snake down our faces and necks with an infuriating tickling sensation. Back then, I thought it was like Chinese water torture. I know different now. "Okay," I whispered, getting to my feet and rubbing the life back into my numb legs. It was a bitterly cold winter night, but through a break in the clouds, the light from the moon made the world glow like it was covered in silver polish. If I hadn't been so focused on breaking the law, I might have stopped to admire the sight. Taking a deep breath, I jogged across the garden to the sitting room windows, trampling over the flower beds to avoid making a noise on the gravel. I stopped when I heard an angry mutter behind me and turned to see Toby, hopping across the mud on one leg and holding his other foot in his hands. "Cat crap," he hissed at me, his expression one of disgust mixed with disbelief. "Why do I always manage to put my foot in crap?" I wanted to smile, but I couldn't. I was too pumped up. Adrenaline flooded my whole body like it did before every job, making my heart beat faster than a hummingbird's wings and sharpening my senses. I felt like an animal, aware of every sound and sight and smell, and ready to turn and flee at the first sign of trouble. Reaching into the long pockets of my coat, I pulled out the only two pieces of equipment, aside from a flashlight, that a burglar ever needs: a glass cutter and the sticky dart from a toy gun. Licking the suction cup on the tip of the dart, I pressed it against the bottom right pane. After a couple of tugs to make sure it was secure, I pressed the blade to the glass and cut a smooth circle. Pocketing the cutter, I pulled the dart gently and the glass popped free, leaving a handy hole in the window. "Voila!" I whispered, grinning despite the unbearable tension of the situation. "Do the honors, Tobster." I stood to one side and looked at Toby, who was trying to clean his shoe in the soil of the flower bed. Each time he wiped it, giant clumps of mud stuck to the mess until his shoe was lost in a massive brown ball, like he just put his foot through a coconut. "Toby!" I shouted. He snapped to attention, pouting. "These cost 100 quid, he said. "Well, buy yourself some new ones with the money you make tonight," I replied, running my hands through my soaking hair. "Buy yourself 20 pairs. Toby grinned back and walked to the window, sliding his small hand inside and fiddling with the clasp. After a few seconds, there was a loud click and the window creaked open. "Wow," he said in shock. "That was almost too easy." I thought so too. It was too easy. I should have guessed then that something funny was going on, but greed is a powerful thing, and all I wanted was to get inside and get out again with as much loot as I could carry. If all went to plan, the proceeds from tonight would mean neither of us had to hit another house for months. "Right, let's do this," I said, gritting my teeth and pulling the window right open. The room inside was dark, but I could make out rows of shelves and a couple of sofas inside. Several unblinking red lights stared at us from the shadows, and I imagined the eyes of some hellish guard dog that would bound from the darkness, fangs bared, ready to chew any intruders to pieces. But they weren't eyes. They were the standby lights from a fortune in electronics that would soon be safely in our bags. "I'll go first," said Toby. "Give me a leg up." He raised his foot, but I didn't move. "I'm not touching that," I said, looking at the giant clumps of mud and crap that looked like they'd been welded to his sneaker. "Why don't you give me a foot up?" He sighed and linked his two hands together to form a cradle. Bracing my foot in his grip, I pushed upward, getting one knee on the window frame and pulling myself inside. Scanning the dark interior to make sure it was empty, I skipped down onto the floor, not making a sound on the soft carpet. Toby was at the window holding 2 duffel bags, and I took them from him before grabbing his arm and hoisting him up. He was almost in when his soiled shoe slipped on the wood of the window frame. With a yelp that was deafening after the tense silence, he fell on me, sending us and a nearby plant stand crashing to the floor. For a second, neither of us could move a muscle. I lay there with Toby's weight on top of me, barely able to hear anything over my thrashing heart. But there was no sound of slamming doors or terrified screams or feet trampling down the stairs. At least we knew for sure now that the house was empty. Toby's clumsiness would have woken the dead. Pushing him off me, I got to my feet and picked up my bag, offering Toby a hand. "Sorry about that," he said sheepishly, pulling himself up. "Never mind, you lump," I replied. "You start putting away some of this electronic stuff. I'm going to go find the cash." 10-4, said Toby, pulling a flashlight from his bag and aiming the beam at the row of high-tech gadgets lined up underneath the enormous television. I left him to it, pulling out my own flashlight and making my way out of the door. You never really get over the sensation of being in someone else's house without their permission. Everything is different. The smell, the atmosphere, even the air tastes strange. I guess that's something to do with the reason I'm always in another person's home. It's as if the building itself doesn't want you there, like it's just waiting for you to slip up before it sucks you into some dark room forever. Trying to ignore my thoughts, I made my way down a small hallway toward the stairs. According to Toby's friend of a friend, the owners had stashed the week's takings in a tin inside their office, along with a bundle of cash from a charity gig they'd held at the weekend. It should be a piece of cake. It was a fairly old house, but well taken care of, and the stairs didn't creak once as I made my way up. I swung my light to and fro to see where I was going, the shadows seeming to dance in front of me like there was an army of goblins hiding in the corners and behind the furniture. I swallowed hard as I neared the top, cursing my imagination. There were 6 doors on the long landing, all closed. Carefully twisting the handle of the first, I found myself staring into a pristine white bathroom. The second door opened outward, revealing an empty closet. Well, almost empty. As I was closing the door, something rushed at me out of the darkness, slapping me on the forehead. I just about screamed, fighting off my attacker before realizing it was a mop. Shoving it back inside, I kicked the closet shut, no longer caring about noise, and walked past a small chest of drawers to the next door. Third time lucky, as they say. This one opened into a large room with a desk against one wall. I made my way straight to it and couldn't believe my eyes. On its walnut surface lay a stack of 10 and 20-pound notes, plus several bags full of coins, what must have been a couple of grand in all. It was as I was reaching for the cash, a massive grin on my face, that I heard the sound of screaming from downstairs. I froze, my skin turning to ice, my scalp seeming to shrivel up so tightly that it hurt. The house wasn't empty. Toby had been rumpled by what sounded like a very shocked woman, which meant he'd make for the nearest exit. I, on the other hand, was stuck up here. I snatched the notes and stuffed them into my pocket. When the shrieks started again, I realized I'd got it wrong. It wasn't the owner screaming. It was Toby. But the shock of that was nothing compared to the fright I got when I turned around. In the shadows behind the office door, right in front of me, was an enormous figure. A man whose black suit blended perfectly with the walls, but whose 2 glinting eyes and vast, sinister grin shone out of the darkness like those of a shark in the cold, dead water of the ocean. The next chapter is called Framed. I don't need to tell you what I did next. I ran, straight for the open door, but the figure was too quick, slamming it shut and reaching out toward me with an arm the size of a tree trunk. I ducked, but he moved like lightning, grabbing the flashlight from my fist and throwing it at the wall. It smashed as it hit a shelf, plunging the room into darkness. Well, almost darkness. All I could see as I backed away from the man were his eyes, which still stood out from the shadows like 2 silver coins. They followed me each time I made a move, never blinking, and so bright that they seemed to burn right into my soul. I had to get out of the room. I had no idea who this guy was, but I was in his house, and judging by the size of him, he could turn me inside out without breaking a sweat. I was wondering whether I could leap through the window without killing myself when he spoke. "Where you gonna run to?" he said, his voice so deep that it sent a vibration through the floorboards. "I can see you, Alex." My heart seemed to stop for an instant as I heard my name. He couldn't know who I was. There was no way. We lived more than a mile away, and we never came to this part of town unless we were hitting a house. Then it struck me. He was a cop. He'd been following Toby and me after a previous job and had framed us by setting up this house as bait. The thought filled me with panic. At last, the thing I never thought would happen was finally happening. I was about to be busted. Another ear-piercing scream penetrated the room from downstairs. What the hell were the police doing to Toby? I suddenly wished I was back at home, tucked away in bed and dreaming. Wished I had never stolen that money from Daniel Richards. And I knew that if I didn't make it out of this room, I wouldn't be back in my own bed for months, maybe years. I fingered the money in my pocket, realizing how pathetic I was to risk everything for a few $100. Money that would be useless behind bars. But maybe it could prove useful here. Grabbing as many of the notes as I could, I wrenched them from my pocket and threw them at the man. I didn't wait to see what effect they'd have, but dived to the floor, rolling under his reach and scrambling to my feet on the other side of the room. I couldn't see the door, it was too dark. I slapped my hands furiously against the wall, knowing that I had only seconds before I felt the cop's huge hand on my shoulder. But there was nothing there except shelves and books. Risking a look behind me, I saw the man's 2 disembodied eyes race across the room, and it was all I could manage not to collapse on the floor screaming. Just as he was above me, however, my hand hit the door frame. Reaching across, I felt the handle and twisted it, ripping the door open so hard that it almost came off its hinges. It struck the man square in the face, but his only response was to laugh. A deep, grating rumble that followed me out onto the landing. "Run, Alex. Run, Alex. Run, run, run," came his voice as I felt my way toward the stairs. What the hell was going on? What kind of cop would say that? I was running too fast and tripped on the top stair, almost plunging into the darkness, before I managed to get a hold on the banister. I tried to plan my escape route as I descended. Obviously, the room we came in through was now a no-go area. I had no intention of meeting whoever was in there with Toby. There was the front door, which lay directly ahead of the stairs. Or I could try to find my way to the back of the house. Either way, I wouldn't get far in the dark. As it turned out, though, it wasn't the dark that got me. Almost as soon as I propelled myself from the bottom step, every light in the house was switched on simultaneously. I gasped and pressed my hands to my eyes, momentum flinging me into a wall. The illumination had completely thrown me, filling my head with stars and causing me to lose my bearings. I squinted against the glare to see that the hall was empty. A quick glance at the front door told me there were too many locks to force it open, so I started running toward the back, hoping for a quick exit. I couldn't tell you what happened next. I'm not sure if it was the fact that my eyes hadn't adjusted to the light, or if fear and adrenaline did something to my brain, but it was as if a figure simply stepped from the wall. One minute my path was clear, the next it was blocked by another mountainous man, so wide and so tall that he seemed to take up every centimeter of space. I skidded to a halt, mouth agape. This man, too, was dressed in a slick black pinstriped suit, with a white shirt and black tie. He looked more like an undertaker than a cop. What scared me most about him, though, was his face. It seemed to be expressionless and grinning at the same time. His silver eyes staring down at me with unmistakable glee, like a boy about to squash a bug. "Boo," he said, his thick voice just as deep and dangerous as that of the man upstairs. I staggered backward, shaking my head. The man had left only one escape route, the way we'd come in. I bolted through the sitting room door, ready to fling myself screaming from the window, but what I saw in that room drained the strength from my body. turning my legs to jelly. It took everything I had to remain upright. The room, which had been deserted less than 5 minutes ago, was now full of men. Each was almost identical in size, dwarfing the furniture and making the large space feel like a doll's house. Each almost identical in looks, too, like brothers. And they were all wearing the same immaculate black suits. I counted 4 in all, and the sound of footsteps behind me made it clear that the other 2 were in the hall. But the figure I couldn't take my eyes off was standing in between the giants, twitching and shaking like he was having a fit. He looked tiny in comparison, barely reaching the elbows of his comrades, and wore a long black leather coat that made his bald head look like pale parchment. I knew now why Toby had been screaming. The man was wearing what looked like a gas mask, an antique, rusted device that covered the lower part of his face and stretched over his shoulder to a tank on his back, like the ones worn by divers. He wheezed noisily through the ancient contraption as if he was having an asthma attack. Peering over the top of the mask, like 2 raisins set into a rancid porridge, were his eyes, and the way they stared at me made me want to curl up and die. It took me a few moments to notice the frail, shaking body of Toby on the floor beneath one of the men in black. He stared at me with a look of pure terror, his eyes wide, pleading for me to help him. I didn't know what to do. I didn't even know who the men were. Taking another look at the shriveled figure by the window, I found myself praying for the familiar uniforms of the police, not this freak show of gas masks and Goliaths. "Nice of you to join us, Alex," said the huge black-suited man who was standing above Toby. His face was a mirror image of the others, only with what looked like a small mole on his chin. His voice, too, was indistinguishable from those I had already heard, like distant thunder. "It looks like everybody here knows my name," I said, the words coming out of my mouth before I even knew I was speaking. Despite the terror that rooted me to the spot, I was determined not to give these men the satisfaction of seeing my fear. If I'd known there was a party here tonight, I would have brought some cake. To my surprise, the men all chuckled at my joke, a noise so deep that it made the remaining glass in the window vibrate. It was the most terrifying sound I'd ever heard. "We wanted to surprise you," the man continued. "Well then, arrest me. Arrest us," I said, just waiting to get out of that room. "You've caught us red-handed. Take us down to the station and we'll confess." The same grating laughter that set my teeth on edge. When it had finished, the giant man turned to his smaller friend as if awaiting a command. Seconds rolled past while the freak in the gas mask studied me and Toby. Then he turned his dark eyes to me and nodded. Why must almost every book have Alex in there? I'd like for them to be nice to me and all the Alexes out there. "Well, Alex." "What?" I asked, desperate to know what was going on. "What the hell does that guy want?" "He wants you to say goodbye to your friend," the man continued. I shook my head, the fear and confusion churning in my stomach. Were they just going to take me and not Toby? "What?" I repeated. Toby was no longer looking at me, but was staring at the carpet, sobbing uncontrollably. "They've got guns with silencers," he said, his voice little more than a whisper. "They're not police, Alex." I didn't understand what Toby had said until the giant man opened his suit jacket to reveal a holstered pistol tucked beneath his armpit. For a second, I felt the world spin as if I was about to pass out, and by the time I'd regained my composure, the man had pulled out the silenced handgun and was pointing it at me. "Last chance to say goodbye," he said. I looked at Toby, wanting this nightmare to end, thinking about the things I'd never be able to do if the man pulled the trigger, thinking about how much I'd miss my friends, how much I loved my family, all lost because of greed. It was so stupid. I couldn't control my emotions anymore, and tears filled my eyes, blurring my vision. All I could see was the outline of the man and the black shadow that was his gun. "Goodbye, Toby," I said through sobs. "I'm sorry." "Alex," was all I heard of his reply. Then the black shadow moved, sweeping downward and emitting a low pop that was barely audible against the laughter that once again filled the room. I tried to blink the tears from my eyes, not quite believing what I'd seen. But when my vision had cleared, I realized there was no escaping what had just happened. Toby lay motionless, his eyes blank, the carpet beneath his body the same horrible color as the wound in his head. It seemed like hours before anyone moved again. It felt as if the connection between my brain and my body had been severed, turning every limb numb. I wanted to feel anger, hatred, sorrow, anything, but all I could do was stare at my friend and the body that would never move again, a corpse with one dirty shoe. My legs finally gave way and I sank to my knees. "Catch!" came the booming voice. The giant man tossed the gun to me and I reached out instinctively, grabbing it by the handle and staring at it in shock. For a second, I pointed it at the black-suited brute, but I had barely held a toy gun before, let alone a real one, and quickly tossed it to the floor. "Now, if I were you, Alex, I'd make a run for it," he continued. "I mean, you just broken into a house, stolen a load of cash, and shot your best friend in the head in cold blood. The police aren't going to like you one little bit, so why don't you put those sneakers to good use and run?" I couldn't respond. I didn't know what he was talking about, but suddenly I felt an enormous pair of hands grip me under my arms and hoist me effortlessly to my feet. The same hands turned me around and pushed me roughly toward the front door, which had been unlocked and opened. "Good luck, Alex," came the voice from behind me. "Run as hard as you can, or sit and cower outside. Either way, we'll see you real soon." I turned and saw the face of the man in black break into a monstrous smile, all teeth and slitted eyes. Then I took one last look at Toby, at rest on his crimson bed, and bolted out into the rain. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Okay, so if you missed what just happened, Alex has just been framed for murder. There was a death, so if anybody's doing my counter, I need an exclamation death for that one. Thank you, Glacier. I appreciate you adding one more death to my otherwise very large counter. We have killed off 238, 239, a lot of people. We are going to go ahead and go into the next chapter, On the Run. What's the most scared you've ever been? Maybe at night, after a horror film, lying under your blankets convinced there's a monster in the room? Or one day in the city when you were younger, realizing you've lost sight of your mom and dad? Perhaps face to face on the playground with somebody who wants to beat the living crap out of you. Multiply those feelings by 1,000,000, and you get me on a dark, wet night, running as fast as I could on the slippery streets to escape the people who'd shot my best friend. I didn't know which direction I was heading in. I just needed to get as far away from that house as possible. And I ran until my legs felt like they were made of lead, until my lungs were on fire and my heart stuttered and stammered like it was about to give out. Then I collapsed by the side of the road, my wheezing sobs so loud that people in the nearby houses actually pulled back their curtains to see what was going on. But nobody came out to help me, and I didn't blame them. When you've committed a few crimes, something about you changes. It's like you've been marked with a tattoo that only other people can see, and it makes them wary so that they cross the street to avoid you. Even now, as helpless as a newborn baby, my tears conspiring with the rain to soak my jeans, I knew I was alone. And I also knew that I couldn't stay out in the open. If what that man had said was true, then they were trying to frame me for murder. And that wasn't just a slapped wrist or a month or two in juvie. That was life in prison. In furnace, with its pits and its punishments and its pain. Pushing to my feet, I looked at the road sign to get my bearings, realizing that my school wasn't too far from here. I took a deep shuddering breath, and started jogging again, making my way down Bryan Avenue and across an abandoned Trafford Road into the row houses that ran along the back of Eastmark High. Toby, Brandon, and I had snuck into school this way countless times to play soccer on the field. I realized that Toby would never play soccer again, and the thought was like a punch to the gut. But I fought back the tears, tried to push the image of my dead friend from my mind as I cut through an overgrown garden and climbed over the worn fence into the dark, deserted field beyond. I didn't learn the word irony until much later, but I guess it was ironic that I ended up walking across the slick grass to the jungle gym, which rose from the wispy layer of pre-dawn mist like the rusted hull of some ghost ship. It was here that everything had started to go wrong. It had only been 2 years since I stole my first cash, but it seemed like forever. I could barely even picture me before that day, a young boy who had never had a bad thought in his life, who wanted to grow up to be a magician, who couldn't care less about money. I pictured that young boy now, saw him turning his back on his friends and walking off into the sunshine to follow a different path. And I hoped that somewhere, in a different dimension, there was a version of me who wasn't sitting alone on an uncomfortable metal bar in the cold, waiting for the police to lock him away forever. The rain had almost stopped. I climbed a little higher to the platform at the top of the jungle gym and leaned against the rail, looking out across the misty field, eerie in the bright moonlight. Every now and again the glow would be shrouded by a passing rain cloud, throwing the whole world into darkness. Each time it happened, I was gripped by terror, the fear that a monstrous dark figure would rise from the fog and snatch me up, carry me away forever. But the moon always fought back, bathing the field and its sole inhabitant in its liquid silver. My options were few and far between. I could sit here and wait for morning, when the school would be full of people all looking for me. I could head home. Surely the news about Toby's death wouldn't have broken yet. And I could talk to my mom and dad about what happened. I could head to Brandon's house, hide out there until I thought of a better plan. I could run, head for the hills and never look back, or I could just go to the police, tell them what had really gone on in that house. I mean, there were 6 giant men and a freak in a gas mask. Somebody else must have seen them. None of those options seemed particularly appealing, so I put them in order of how bad they were. Running seemed like the worst thing I could do, closely followed by waiting here and going to the police. That left Brandon and my own home. I thought about seeing my mom again, and it filled me with a strange mix of sadness and joy. Maybe she could just give me a hug, and all of this would go away. Surely moms had the power to make anything go away. But the thought of confessing to her was almost as unbearable as the thought of a lifetime inside furnace. It would have to be Brandon's. I was so lost in thought that I didn't notice the change in light until it was almost too late. Looking at my jeans, I saw they were shimmering with a red and blue haze, not unlike a disco light. But this was no disco. I snatched my head up to see 2 police cars sitting 100 meters away outside the school's main gate, casting a web of color across the dark grass. Several armored men were climbing out of the vehicles, most equipped with rifles and flashlights, and one holding what looked like a bolt cutter. They walked to the gates, the cop with the cutters using them to snap through the heavy chain before kicking them open. He pointed at the school building, and 2 of the police with flashlights started running toward it. Then he scanned the playing field, his eyes coming to rest on my jungle gym. He gestured my way. I ducked behind the rail as 2 beams of light struck the metal frame, seeking me out. There wasn't much cover, but the police were too far away to see me. Not for long, though. As I watched, the 2 men started jogging across the grass in my direction. I shuffled backward across the platform until I reached the rear edge, ready to drop down to the ground. But before I could, my eye caught a piece of graffiti that I swear had never been there before. Carved into the soft wood of the platform, in large, even letters, were 3 words that made my blood freeze. "Keep running, Alex." I traced my fingers across the markings to make sure they were real, but the sensation of splinters in my skin let me know that this was no dream. The men, whoever they were, had known what I'd do before I did. The sound of footsteps pounding the wet grass reminded me that the police were getting closer. I shoved myself off the rear of the frame, landing awkwardly on the soft ground and backing into the darkness. Turning, I sprinted toward the fence, forcing my tired legs to work. Scrambling out into the overgrown garden, I scanned the street to make sure it was empty, then turned left and started walking toward Brandon's house. I hadn't spoken to Brandon much since Toby and I had started robbing houses instead of students. It was as if he could see that invisible tattoo too, and it was pretty clear from the way he acted now that he was scared of us, of what we'd become. But we'd been close friends once, and even when you've been to hell and back, your friends stick by you. I cut up Edwards Avenue, taking another left at the top of the hill, and making my way toward Bessemer Road. The houses in this part of town were all huge, their 4 stories staring out across the tract housing below like they were laughing at them. I guess that's one of the reasons Brandon had backed out. Even though his parents only owned an apartment up here, they weren't exactly poor. Not that I was stealing bread so that I could stay alive. I'm no Oliver Twist. I spotted the building that Brandon's apartment was in and crossed the road, trying to stick to the blanket of shadows that kept most of the street in darkness. All the lights were off, which wasn't surprising given that it was long after midnight, but I knew which room was his. Sneaking in through the front gate, I picked up a couple of small stones from the graveled path and pulled back my arm to launch them at the second-floor window. Before I could, something grabbed my wrist, a vice-like grip that felt like it could have torn the whole limb off. I yelped, as much from the shock as the pain, and spun around, to see a horribly familiar face standing right behind me, his silver eyes glinting, the same tiny mole on his chin and his soulless smile beaming at me like the Cheshire Cat's. It was impossible. He hadn't been there seconds before, and nobody could move that quickly, that quietly. "Didn't your mother tell you never to throw stones?" the man in the suit asked, his voice so powerful that it felt as if it was being transmitted right into the center of my brain. I couldn't respond. My whole body felt numb. The man tightened his grip on my arm, bending down until his face was almost touching mine. "Not long till sunrise, Alex," he said, the scent of his breath like sour milk. "And now you've got these guys to deal with." He twisted my wrist, spinning me around and giving me a shove that propelled me back out of the gate. I tripped on my own feet, staggering backward off the curb and landing in a heap on the road. I glanced up just in time to see a police car slam on its brakes, squealing to a stop seconds before its front bumper made friends with my forehead. I looked back to Brandon's garden, but it was empty. The man in black had vanished just as quickly as he had appeared. I heard the sound of the car doors opening, and I leaped to my feet, backing away from the vehicle. A policeman in beetle black body armor was making his way toward me, his expression one of concern. A policewoman held back, one hand on her radio, the other on the nasty-looking nightstick that hung from her belt. "You okay?" the man asked, stepping closer. "You just came out of nowhere. Did we hit you?" I kept on retreating, my eyes flitting back and forth from the man to the woman. Her radio bleeped, the sound filling the whole street, before a voice spoke from the static. I couldn't make out what it said, but I knew from the way she looked at me that it wasn't good. "It's him!" she shouted, wrenching the stick from her belt and advancing. Her partner's expression instantly morphed into one of anger, and he pounced, leaping toward me. Up until tonight, I'd have thought he was a big guy, and quick too. But compared with the man in black, the cop looked tiny, and his move was sluggish. I darted to my left, angling my body so that his hands missed me, then swiveled, pushing him square in the back and sending him sprawling onto the wet ground. His partner shrieked at me to stop, vaulting over the car's hood with her nightstick held high, ready to knock me into next week. I don't know how I did it, but somehow I managed to start running again. You must remember how your legs feel after running laps in gym class, when they're so exhausted that it seems like you're running underwater. That was how it felt. leaping back onto the pavement and hurtling down that road, trying to hold off the sobs so I could breathe. When I looked back, remembering that policewoman, who only chased me to the end of the street before returning to her car, it doesn't seem too bad. I mean, I've run screaming from far worse things since that night. Creatures that never stop chasing you. There was only one place left to go, and I headed there at full pelt. I don't remember the journey. It was as if my brain had shut down so that all my energy could be directed to my feet. And I couldn't stop running, even when I reached my house. If I kept moving, then nobody could catch me. Not the police who were gathered outside, not the men in black suits who were waiting in the shadows, watching everything through silver eyes. If I could just make it inside, then all the bad things would go away. So I didn't stop. Not when the police started shouting, not when the officers in black masks and bulletproof vests ran into the street with rifles, not when my mom came racing out of the front door dressed in her pink nightie and slippers, screaming at me to give myself up. I just put my head down and cried to her with all my strength. I don't know how I even managed to stay upright. The world was spinning so fast. But I made it past the first policeman, my sheer momentum sending him flying. The second backed out of my way, his expression of shock almost comical. I could see my mom, tears streaming down her face, being held back by two policewomen. I could see the open door behind her, the warm glow of the kitchen. If I could just make it 10 more steps, then maybe all this could end. Maybe I could find Daniel Richards, give him his money back. It was only 20 quid. I hit the third policeman square on. He was built like a fire plug, all chest and shoulders, and I bounced off. The wind knocked out of me. I charged forward again, but it was too much. My legs cramped and I dropped to my knees for the second time that night. I reached out to my mom and she reached out to me, but the air between us was instantly flooded with black uniforms, blotting her out like flies. Then I was on the ground. Strangers' knees on my back, their nightsticks against my skull, and sharp metal around my wrists. "I didn't do it," I sobbed. "I didn't do it." But I couldn't even lift my head from the sidewalk, and with the weight of the world on my shoulders, only the cold, wet concrete beneath me heard my denial. Denial and damnation. I didn't do it. It seemed like the only things I said for the next few days, a kind of mantra that I kept pumping out as a defense against all the questions and accusations. The first ones at my throat were the cops who threw me into a van, whose taunts and threats cut into me with far more force than the cuffs that bound me to the seat. "How could you do it?" "I didn't do it." "He was your friend." "I didn't do it." "Well, you're gonna pay, kid." "I didn't do it." Next, it was the detectives. They started nice, like they always do in the movies, offering deals and leniency if I just confessed. But the more I denied it, the harder they got. Their questions so relentless that by the third day, when they were kicking over my chair and blowing cigarette smoke in my face, I barely knew whether I was guilty or not. Then came Toby's parents, who sat on the other side of a table clutching each other and screaming at me, their eyes burning with more hatred than I have ever seen in anyone. Their anger only held in check by the cops who rested hands on their quivering shoulders and told them I'd get what was coming to me. By this time, my mantra was a whisper, little more than a breath, but I kept saying it because, like a breath, it was the only thing keeping me alive. The worst questions came from the people I loved, my mom and dad. I was separated from them by a dirty plastic window, but there was a far greater barrier between us. I could tell by the way my mom couldn't meet my eye that she thought I was guilty, and she refused to listen to my pleas just like everybody else. There may as well have been a gorge between us, or a mountain, and by the time she was guided out of the room by my dad's unsteady hands, I couldn't even find the energy to whisper my denials. For 3 weeks, I endured an interrogation every day and was thrown into a cell each night. Of course, I told them everything that had happened, the men in the black suits, the sinister figure in the gas mask, the way they had shot Toby in cold blood. But even as I was talking, the words seemed ludicrous, hollow. I didn't blame them for laughing at me. I'd never have believed my story either if I hadn't lived the nightmare myself. My trial was an extension of the same empty process. I was marched into court with an armed escort and chained inside a cage, the kind better suited to serial killers and military generals accused of war crimes, not terrified kids. The heavy bars didn't stop the hatred directed at me when the hearing began. It poured through like ice water from a judge who was already convinced I was a killer, from a jury that had made up its mind about this case as soon as it started, and from the crowd in the public gallery who bayed for my punishment like hyenas. I felt like I was drowning in their contempt and just prayed for it to be over, even if it meant sinking without a trace. My spirits were lifted only once when, midway through the second day, the doors of the courtroom opened and 2 men strode through. Dressed in black and larger than life, they were instantly recognizable. The men who had sent me here. The room fell silent as soon as they entered, even the judge lowering his voice from respect, or maybe fear. "That's them!" I shouted as they took their seats. "They're the men who framed me. They killed Toby!" But the judge simply banged his gavel and fixed me with a contemptuous stare. "Of course they are," he said, his voice oily with sarcasm. "These men are representatives from Furnace Penitentiary. Is this what your defense has come to? Accusing anybody of your crimes? Was I there? Did I have a disagreement with your accomplice and pull the trigger too?" The jury laughed, and the men in black suits unveiled their shark grins and flashed their silver eyes at me. I was like a fish on the end of a line, waiting to be reeled in. It took the jury less than 40 minutes to decide my fate. 12 men and women in a room with my life in their hands, and they condemned me in less time than the first half of a soccer match. Not that I'm trying to pass the buck. I hadn't killed Toby, but his blood was on my hands, just like my blood was on his. If we hadn't been so stupid, then none of this would have happened. We'd both have been at school just like any other day, tormenting teachers, chasing girls, and being kids. I'll never forget the judge's closing speech when the jury announced the guilty verdict. He stood, his walnut desk like a pulpit, and his booming voice and thrashing limbs like those of a preacher damning the devil. "Your crimes are heinous and unforgivable," he shouted, the flecks of foam around his mouth visible even from where I was standing. "Like so many of today's youth, you have taken your life and squandered it, turning to crime instead of honor, sickness instead of decency. You have killed in cold blood. You are a coward and a thief and a murderer, and like all the other festering waste of society who come through this court, I am happy to sentence you without remorse and without pity." He leaned forward, never taking his eyes off me. "You knew very well, when you pulled that trigger, what your punishment would be," he hissed. "There is no longer any leniency for child offenders, not since the summer of slaughter, and like those murderous teenagers, you will never again see the light of day. If it was up to me, I would see you hanged by the neck until you were dead, but, alas, I must settle for this." He paused again, smiling wickedly to himself. "Only, perhaps, settle is the wrong word. Perhaps this is a fate even worse." I knew what was coming. I clenched my fingers around the bars, praying one last time that something would happen to end this sick and twisted dream. But it was too late. It was over. "Alex Sawyer, I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment at the Furnace Penitentiary with no possibility of parole. You will be taken from here this afternoon and incarcerated for the remainder of your days." The resulting wave of cheers and shouts, the banging of the gavel and the roaring in my ears as the truth sank in, drowned out the only thing I could think of to say. I didn't do it. I don't remember much else about that day. I have a vague recollection of being dragged from the courtroom by the armed guards, the men in black holding open the door and telling me once again that they'd see me very soon. I couldn't quite remember how to use my legs, so they literally pulled me along the marble-clad corridors, past the crowds with their expressions of hatred and disgust, past my own parents, whose faces I could not make out because they turned away. I recall only one thing with any clarity. As I was passing a second courtroom, the doors flew open to reveal another boy, a similar age to me, being hauled kicking and screaming from inside. He was giving the bailiffs a hard time, his flailing body sending one crashing to the floor and causing the other to reach for his taser. With the flash, 50,000 volts sent the boy hurtling across the corridor, leaving him in a groaning, smoking pile. But even then I could make out his protests, and they sent a chill down my spine. "It wasn't me," he whispered as the men picked him up. "It wasn't me." For the briefest of seconds, our eyes met. It was like looking into a mirror, the fear, the panic, the defiance. I knew instantly that what had happened to me had also happened to him. Our dark fates entwined by the same men, our lives broken by an identical deception. And then he was gone. I was carried down the corridor, my memories of the moment lessening with each step and fading away completely as I climbed into the truck that would take me to my new home, to the place I would spend the rest of my life, to my own personal hell, to Furnace. Buried alive. I'm betting you've all seen some prison films or watched cop shows where the bad guys get sent to jail. You know what they look like. Miles of fences topped with razor wire so sharp it hurts just to look at it. Sprawling grounds watched over at all times by million-watt spotlights, and towers with guns. Lifeless buildings that rise up from the ground like great gray tombstones. Tiny windows from which ghostly faces stare at an outside world they can no longer know. Not Furnace. Our prison bus took us straight there. Me, the kid who'd been stunned, and 2 other teenage guys, all as pale as church candles and cowering back into our seats, as if somehow we could avoid arriving at our inevitable destination. All the while, the police guards shook their shotguns at us and jeered, asking us if we'd seen Furnace on the newscasts, if we knew what it looked like, if we had any idea of the horrors that lay ahead. I knew. I'd seen Furnace on TV like everybody else. After that summer when so many kids had turned to murder, they made sure that everyone in the country got a good look at the prison. They thought it would make us too scared to break the law, too scared to carry knives and cut people up for just looking at them the wrong way, too scared to take a human life. Looking around, I guess they hadn't been too successful. There had been protesters, of course, the human rights supporters who claimed that locking a child away for life was wrong, but you can only argue with the truth for so long, and that summer when the gangs ran wild and the streets ran red, everything changed. Even in the eyes of the liberals, we weren't kids anymore. We were killers. All of us. I used to always think that the waiting was the worst part, but when we rounded a corner and Furnace finally came into sight, I knew I'd rather have stayed on that bus for an eternity than get any closer to this monstrosity ahead. It was just like on the news, a towering sculpture of dark stone, bent and scarred like it had been burned into existence. The Black Fort, the way in. The windowless building stretched upward, its body merging with a crooked spire that resembled a finger beckoning us forward. Smoke rose from a chimney hidden behind the building, a cloud of poisoned breath waiting to engulf us. All in all, it looked more like something from Mordor than a modern prison. As we neared, I could make out some of the details that the news crews had left out. Carved into the cold stone were vast sculptures designed to inspire fear into anybody who saw them. Tortured statues, each 5 meters tall, showing prisoners on the gibbets, hanging from ropes, on guillotines, pleading to executioners, being dragged from loved ones, and, worst of all, a giant head on each corner impaled on a spike. The dead faces watched us, and if I didn't know better, I could have sworn their expressions were of pity, their sorrowful eyes wet from the gentle rain that fell. "Doesn't look so bad," said one of the other boys, his quivering voice betraying his true feelings. "Well, That ain't the half of it, boyo, replied one of the guards, tapping the shotgun on the window. That there is Furnace's better side. You know where you're going. He lowered his weapon so it was pointing at the floor. Down. He was right, of course. The building ahead was only the entrance, the gateway to the fiery pits below, the mouth that led to the sprawling guts of Furnace, which lay hundreds of meters beneath the ground. I remember when they started building it, I must have been 6 or 7, a different person, how they'd found a crevice in the rock that seemed to go on forever. They had built the prison inside the hole and plugged the only way out with a fortress. Anyone wanting to dig himself out of this mess only had a couple of miles of solid rock to get through before he was free. I guess that's when it finally sank in. The thought of being down there, underground, for the rest of my life, suddenly hit me like a hammer in the face. I couldn't breathe. My head started to swim. The bile rose in my throat. I sat forward in my seat and stared at the floor, desperately trying to think about something else. Something good. But all I could see now were the stains of 100 other prisoners who had thrown their guts up in confronting the reality of their fate. I couldn't hold it back. I puked, the mess hitting the seat in front and causing the guard to leap away. I retched a couple more times and looked up through blurry eyes, expecting a furious reaction. But they were laughing. "Looks like you win again," said one, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a 10-quid note. "How do you always guess which one is going to hurl first?" "When you've been on the job as long as I have," came the reply, "you just know." There was more, but I couldn't hear it over the sound of the retching and sobbing that echoed back at me from the stained upholstery. When the bus eventually stopped, we were herded out like sheep. I felt like I'd thrown up a couple of vital organs as well as the contents of my stomach, and my legs were so wobbly that I thought I was going to collapse when I stood. But as soon as we were outside, the sensation of rain on my face perked me up a little. Well, it did until I remembered that this might be the last time I would ever stand in the rain. We were right outside the main gate, in a giant cage that gave off a sinister hum and made my head throb whenever I got too close to the bars. I didn't have to know much about physics to guess that it took a hell of an electrical charge to have that effect. The entrance to Furnace was suitably terrifying. 2 enormous black gates topped with a plinth marked with the word "Guilty." As soon as we were lined up, the gates swung open with a sound not unlike fingernails running down a blackboard, revealing a gray room with nothing in it except 2 men, dressed in black, leaning casually against the walls, and a nasty-looking gun mounted on the ceiling. The men grinned at us and stepped forward. I felt my legs going weak again just at the sight of them, and I wasn't alone. The other 3 boys shuffled away in fear, and even the armed guards moved back toward the bus. "They're all yours," said one of the guards, his voice little more than a whisper. He pulled a palm lap from his jacket and held it out with a shaking hand. "If you could just print here." One of the giants in suits strode forward and snatched the device, pressing his thumb against the screen until it beeped loudly. He watched the armed guard scramble onto the bus, then turned his attention to us. I studied his face. With their glinting eyes and their menacing smiles, the men in black all looked the same, but I recognized this one, the mole on his chin letting me know it was the man who had shot Toby. "We told you," he said, placing his hand on the shoulder of the boy beside me, but talking to us all. "You could run, but you couldn't hide. And now, here you are, guests of honor at Furnace Penitentiary." The other man walked to the front of the line and grabbed the kid by the scruff of his shirt, pulling him forward. "This way," he said, his voice like the sound of continents shifting. We shuffled forward, our steps tiny in the hope that maybe we'd never reach the threshold. It was as the first boy passed through the doors that the second, the guy who'd been stunned at the court, suddenly made a break for it. He pounced to the side and stepped backward, all the while looking at the men guarding us. "You framed me!" he shouted, his face twisted into a mask of anger and fear. "I didn't kill anybody, and now I'm spending the rest of my life in this nightmare. I won't let you do it!" The two men started laughing, their thunderous peals echoing off the stone walls. Then, in the blink of an eye, the one to the right of me burst across the dusty ground and with a mighty crack sent the boy flying toward the fence. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't have believed the speed of the man. He moved so fast he left traces in the air, like sparklers on a summer night. The boy hit the floor and rolled, ending in a crumpled heap perilously close to the electrified bars. "You wouldn't be the first one to fry on that cage," said the man, walking until he stood over the boy. "But it's a shame to waste you on something as quick and painless as the barbecue." He reached down and picked the boy up by his collar, like a bear scooping up a rag doll, then carried him back to the line. The kid had a bloody lip and a dazed expression like he'd just been hit by a freight train, yet somehow he was managing to stand. He lowered his eyes to the floor, but I saw him flash the man with a murderous look as soon as his back was turned. "Now that little rebellion is out of the way, I hope you realize just how serious this is," said the first man, walking to the front of the line and ushering us forward. "This is a private institution sanctioned by the government, which means that we now own you. You have been sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. So, short of a revolution in the country or an act of God, you will die here. Not that God would ever mess with Furnace." I faltered as I reached the threshold, staring at the line that separated the ground outside from the polished stone of the room ahead. It was just one more step, but it was the last one I would take as a free person. With a shuddering sigh, I lifted my leg and planted my foot down on the other side of the wall. It might have just been my imagination, but the sound of that footstep seemed to reverberate around the room. A death knell mourning a lost life. "As you can see, the manner of your death isn't important to us," the man continued, guiding our group through the featureless room toward the metal door in one wall. "Of course, the state has no death penalty, but any attempted escape will be dealt with using lethal force." The door opened to reveal a long corridor ahead, as featureless as the room we'd just left. I cast one final look behind me, catching a glimpse of dark cloud through the main gates before they slammed shut. It was a fleeting image, but one I will never forget. There's no one you can cry to, no one you can beg to. The public have judged you and found you guilty. As far as they are concerned, you are already dead. The corridor ended with another door, this one guarded by a third man, also in black. He nodded to his colleagues as he unlocked the cage and winked a silver eye at us as he waited for it to slide open. We passed through, finding ourselves in a small room with a hole in one wall. "Line up and take your prison uniforms," the man continued. "One each, then go through that door for purging." We obeyed. What choice did we have? One by one we walked by the hole in the wall, and from the shadows we were past a pair of paper shoes, underwear that felt like sandpaper, and a hunk of stiff, striped cloth that was better suited to holding potatoes than wearing. The white uniform was branded with the furnace symbol, 3 circles arranged in a triangle, a dot in the middle of each, and thin lines joining them. I followed the boys in front through the door to find another room, this one full of tiny cubicles. "Get in, strip, and wash," came the booming voice behind us. I picked a door, left my new uniform on a shelf outside, and entered. There were directions on the wall, and I followed them, taking off my clothes and placing them in a chute where they vanished from sight. Shivering in the cold, I pressed a large red button in front of me and was instantly hit by a fist of freezing water. I doubled over, pressing myself against the wall to avoid the stream, but the cubicle was too small and I had to endure it for what seemed like an eternity. When the spray stopped, I followed the instructions again and held my breath while a cloud of gas was pumped in. It stung my eyes and my skin, and even after the directed 30 seconds, when I took a gasping breath, the gas still flooded my lungs, making my chest feel like it was on fire. Staggering out of the door, I put on my uncomfortable uniform and watched as the other 3 boys emerged from their cubicles, each one red-eyed, pale-skinned and coughing. We looked like phantoms haunting the room where we died, which wasn't too far from the truth, I guess. His malicious grin as wide as ever, the man steered us across the room to a set of elevator doors. He whispered something into his collar, and seconds later the doors opened, revealing a machine gun on the ceiling of the elevator car, which swung around to face us. "This is where we part company, for now," he said. "This elevator will take you all to your cells. Don't try anything funny or you'll end up decorating the walls." He pushed us forward with his massive hands and we entered the cavern, the remote turret following our every move. "It's quite a ride down to the bowels of the earth," he said as the doors began to close, "so I hope none of you are claustrophobic." Then he was gone, and with the deafening whir of gears, the armored elevator began its descent to the darkness at the bottom of the world. The descent? For the first minute or so, none of us spoke. We didn't even look each other in the eye. It was a strange mix of emotions. There was fear, of course, so thick you could almost smell it beyond the stink of dust and oil, but there was also something else. I guess it was pride. If we acknowledged each other, then we were also acknowledging our own helplessness, our own panic, and after what we'd just been through, nobody wanted to do that. In the end, it was me who broke the ice. "I just want to get this out in the open," I said above the sound of the elevator's descent. "I didn't kill anyone. They framed me. They shot my friend and set me up for the fall. I'm not a killer." Gradually, the other three boys raised their heads, and for the first time, we all got a good look at each other. "Join the club," said the kid who I'd seen in court. He was shorter than me, but wider, his body tensed like a cat that's puffed up its fur. He brushed a strand of untidy hair away from his face and cast a nervous gaze up at the machine gun in the ceiling, before continuing. "Those guys in the black drove a car into some old woman. Killed her. They knew everything about me. They got my prints onto the wheel. They knew I wouldn't have an alibi that night or any way of proving I didn't do it. Name's Z, by the way." "Z?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. The question brought a brief smile to his face. "Got 4 older brothers and sisters. Mom was adamant that I was the last one, so she called me Z. What about you?" "Alex," I replied. I looked at the other 2 kids. They were the complete opposite of each other. One resembled a beanpole, his uniform hanging off him like rags on a scarecrow. The other had probably eaten way too many chocolate bars in his time, but his green eyes were sharp, and his gaze fierce. "Jimmy," said the beanpole, hoisting up his trousers. "Yeah, I didn't kill nobody either. Same story as you, Alex. They murdered a friend of mine. Stabbed him, though." We all turned to look at the fat kid. For a minute, it seemed like he was going to cry, then his expression hardened, and with his fist clenched, he spat out 2 words that sent chills down all of us. "My sister." There was still no sign of the elevator stopping. It might have just been a psychological trick to make us feel like we were going deeper than we were, but I doubted it. It takes a long time to travel a mile underground. "You saying they framed us all?" asked Z, shaking his head. "Doesn't make any sense. Why would they do it?" "Maybe they've got cells to fill, targets to reach," suggested Jimmy, but his tone of voice made it clear he didn't know. None of us did. Not then. "Listen," I said, certain that the elevator car was bugged and motioning for the other boys to come closer. "Whatever happens in there, whatever they've got in store for us, we've got to stick together, right?" "I've got your back," said Z. "I'm getting out of here no matter what." "The only way you're getting out is in a coffin," hissed the kid who had lost his sister. "Haven't you heard about this place? There is no way out." "Well, I'm with you guys," said Jimmy, ignoring the remark. "Ain't no way I'm spending the rest of my life in this hole." The noise of the elevator shifted pitch, and with a bone-breaking shudder, it came to a halt. Before the doors could open, however, there was one last hate-filled remark from the corner of the cabin. "We're all gonna die in here." The moment the elevator doors opened, my senses came under attack. I can describe what I saw when I stepped out into Furnace, but I can't tell you how I felt. I was so overloaded by what lay before me that I'm sure part of my brain shut down, just so that it wouldn't overheat. It was like a survival mechanism to stop me going insane. I took in the details, but they didn't register on any emotional scale. The elevator had taken us to the very depths of the prison, a stretch of bare stone that was easily the size of a soccer field, and above us, for as far as we could see, lay its tortured, twisted interior. Furnace certainly deserved its name. The walls were made from the very rock of the earth, their surfaces rough and red, and the half-light of the room made them flicker as if they were on fire. The sunless yard was vast and circular, and arranged in rings around the outside were countless cells, the gray metal platforms and jagged staircases resembling a rib cage against the fleshy walls. I stared at the elevator shaft, which rose in a relentless line above our heads, the top barely visible where it entered the red rock of the ceiling, broken only by a giant video screen hanging over the doors. The elevator was the only way in or out, and there was absolutely no other means of getting back up. The hiss of pneumatics snapped my attention back to the walls beside us, and I saw 2 more machine guns protruding from the rock like black limbs. They trained their sights on us as we staggered from the elevator into the vast chamber, each with an unblinking red eye that seemed to assess our every move. I wondered whether there was a human at the other end of the controls, or whether some dark robotic intelligence had its finger on the trigger, ready to fire at the smallest sign of trouble. I couldn't decide which would be worse. I was so overawed by the prison itself that it took me a while to notice it was full of people. They swarmed across the courtyard in front of us, mostly kids about my age, some a little older, and even a couple who looked like they should still be in middle school. Some hung out in groups, their stares and swaggers a clear message that they were in charge. Others hung back in the shadows or peered over the bars of the platform, all sickly faces and baggy eyes. Most were staring at us, some laughing and shouting, "New fish!" Others shaking their heads in compassion. Their gaze made my cheeks burn, and I lowered my head so nobody would see. It didn't take long for a few of the kids to step forward, but it was pretty clear that they weren't a welcoming party. Each of the 6 boys wore a black bandana with a crude picture of a skull painted on the front. It would have been laughable if they didn't all look as though they were about to make us walk the plank. "Let me guess," I said, starting to speak before I even knew I was doing it. "You're in here for piracy." I heard Z snigger to my side, but there wasn't even a hint of a smile in the pockmarked faces before me. One of the boys, not the biggest but by far the ugliest, stepped right up to me, so close that I could see the dirt clogging his pores. "Get this straight from the start, new fish," he said, jabbing me in the chest with a filthy fingernail. "You on our turf now, so you take orders from me." My heart was pounding so hard it felt like something inside me was about to burst. I tried meeting his glare with one of my own and was holding up pretty well, until I suddenly started thinking that this was how the kids at school must have felt when Toby and I had pressed them for money. Powerless, furious, ashamed. The thought washed through me like acid and my head dropped. Looking back, that little moment of self-realization probably saved my life. I seen the skulls kill people for nothing more than standing up to them. "You all belong to me," the kid continued, speaking slowly and emphasizing each word by prodding us, one by one, in the chest. "No getting away from that. You all skull fodder now." Z started to say something. It sounded like it was going to be a witty comeback, but fortunately for him, he was interrupted by the sound of a siren. It was deafening, cutting through my head and reverberating up the steep walls of the prison until the echoes died out near enough 20 seconds later. By that time, the boys had backed away, joining the rest of the inmates who were flooding toward the center of the giant courtyard. I noticed a yellow ring painted onto the floor and wondered whether we should be heading toward it too. But it was too late to move. The siren rang out again, and a metal door the size of a bus to the left of the elevator began to hiss and rumble, mechanisms inside grinding and turning as they released a series of locks. With a blast of steam, the vault door swung open lazily on its enormous hinges, revealing a sight that I knew there and then I would take with me to my grave. The guards came out first, 3 of them all in black suits and all holding shotguns in their massive fists. They strolled from the steam-filled corridor beyond like they were going for a walk in the park, their silver eyes full of cold humor. They made me nervous, no doubt about it, but that wasn't what filled me with terror. Behind them came 2 more figures that looked horribly familiar, their stunted bodies covered by leather overcoats, their shriveled, pasty faces concealed by ancient masks that wheezed noisily. They were almost lost in the shadows of their guards as they twitched and shook their way out, but their black eyes, which looked as lifeless as the lumps of coal in a snowman's face, never left us. I recalled the first time I'd met one of these monstrosities, the way it had picked Toby to die without the slightest trace of emotion. I felt anger well up inside me, but I was powerless to do anything about it. Besides, it wasn't even these freaks who made the scene ahead so horrific. It was the man who walked out after them. At first glance, he seemed like an ordinary guy in his 40s, pretty tall, very lean, dark hair and a clean gray suit. But the more I studied him, the more I realized there was something very wrong with the way he looked. His face was too angular, the skin pulled tight against the bone beneath it like he was a skeleton dressed in someone else's flesh. Flesh that looked more like leather when it caught the light. The weird thing was that I tried looking him in the eye, but I simply couldn't do it. My gaze just bounced off like there was some kind of force field around his face. I know that sounds stupid, but I can't think of any other way to describe it. Whenever I looked him right in the eye, I found myself staring at something else instead. His chin, his suit, the wall. I mean, what the hell was that all about? The cherries on the sick cake that lay before me, the sight that really struck fear into my heart, were the 2 creatures who trotted out after their master. If the devil had dogs, it would be these. They were huge, bigger than Irish wolfhounds, their heads easily level with my shoulders. The creatures glistened in the red light of the prison, and it took me a while to work out why. When I realized, I almost threw up my guts again. They didn't have any skin. Their slick bodies were made up of muscles and tendons that bulged in plain view, throbbing gently with the beating of their hearts. As they moved, you could see their insides working, the muscles stretching, then contracting, finally tensing when the group came to a halt. Their faces were entirely devoid of fur, 2 silver eyes embedded into their flesh and glaring at our group like we were dinner. I took an involuntary step back, but stopped dead when the dogs started growling. "It doesn't take long to learn obedience in this place," came a voice so gravelly and deep that for a second I thought it was being broadcast directly into my skull. But the man with the dogs was moving his mouth, so I assumed the words came from him. "And obedience is the difference between life, death, and the other varieties of existence on offer here in Furnace." The man stepped forward, his dogs trotting by his heels. "Obey my rules and you'll do just fine. Disobey them and you'll soon learn that here your nightmares exist on the same plane as you. They stalk the same corridors and haunt your cells. It's only me that stands between you and insanity. Anyway, where are my manners? My name is Warden Cross, and I run this institution. I know who you are, and I know your crimes. But here, everybody is guilty, so we do not judge you by the paths you took, only by the way you choose to live in this prison." He stopped a short distance before us, and I could swear the temperature dropped several degrees. I don't know why, but I started to think of him as a black hole, like he sucked all the life and warmth and goodness from whatever was nearby. The closer he got, the more it felt as though something was being wrenched out of my body. I squirmed in discomfort, beads of sweat forming on my forehead.
You've already broken the first and most important rule of Furnace, the warden went on. But since you didn't know it, I guess we'll excuse you this once. When the siren sounds, you must be either in your cell or in the yellow circle in the yard. Anyone breaks that rule, then I can't guarantee their safety. He gestured at the guns on the wall. It's a precautionary measure, you understand. I didn't, but I kept mum. If you hear one long blast on the siren, then you must get to your cells. That means lockdown, and that's when things really turn nasty if you're left outside. This time he nodded at the dogs, which began to drool messily on the stone floor. There are, of course, other codes of conduct, and you will all have plenty of time to become acquainted with them. But let's get you settled in. I mean, we're not monsters. His face erupted into a crooked smile. Well, not all of us. One of the men in black handed the warden a sheet of paper, and he studied it for a moment. Z. Hatcher, he read. Prisoner number 2013832. Your cell is D24, 4th level. Cellmate Carlton Jones. There was a shuffling from the crowd of inmates, and a small red-headed boy stepped to the edge of the yellow circle. He nodded nervously in the direction of the warden, then motioned for Z to approach him. I watched him go, feeling like I'd been robbed of my best friend even though we'd only just met. Montgomery Earl, the warden continued, looking at the doughy kid. Prisoner number 2013833, cell number E15, 5th level. Cellmate Kevin Arnold. Hell no, came a voice from the crowd. It was the ugly kid dressed like a pirate. I felt my heart sink for poor Montgomery. I knew exactly what life would be like for him paired with that thug. The warden glared at Kevin, and the boy stopped his protests, muttering something to the other skulls who stood nearby. Better get moving, the warden said. Montgomery trotted off toward the yellow circle, but I couldn't watch to see what happened. Alex Sawyer, prisoners number 2013834, cell number F11, 6th level. Cellmate Carl Donovan. I looked over at the crowd, but nobody came forward. I said, Carl Donovan, the warden hissed, his leathery face creasing in displeasure. Gradually, a tall, well-built kid a little older than me stepped forward, pushing past the people in front of him and staring at me like I was something his cat had coughed up. I ran a hand through my hair, then walked slowly across the uneven stone. The warden was dishing out a cell to Jimmy, but I wasn't really listening. Hey, I said meekly when I reached the boy who I'd be living with for God only knew how long. He looked down his nose at me and just snorted, then turned and started walking back through the crowd. Behind me, I heard the warden shout out across the courtyard. Beneath heaven is hell, boys, and beneath hell is furnace. I hope you enjoy your stay. Settling in. The kid called Carl led me across to the back of the courtyard, never once turning to see if I was following. He bounded up a set of stairs, and I ran to keep up with him, tripping on more than one step in my desperation not to be left behind. At one point, I heard the siren again and completely missed my footing, scraping my shin on the sharp metal and crying out in pain. I looked back out over the yard to see the massive vault door swing open and the macabre group vanish into the wall, all except for the men in black suits who stalked the floor with their shotguns. Carl leaped up 5 more flights of stairs without so much as panting. By the time I'd caught up with him, I was breathing like a broken vacuum cleaner and sweating like a sumo wrestler in a sauna. He was standing outside our cell looking impatient, and I apologized as I walked past him through the door. I don't really know what I'd been expecting. I knew it wouldn't be the Hilton or even a travel lodge, but when I thought about my cell, I pictured something the same size as my old room, with a bed and a wardrobe and maybe even a plant or something. As it was, I had to stop short as soon as I entered the tiny room, or else I'd have banged my nose on the far wall. The cell was little bigger than our garden shed, and most of that was taken up by a set of metal bunk beds that looked better suited to 8-year-olds having a sleepover. Aside from a toilet wedged into one corner, the only other thing in there was a bad smell. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered under my breath. I felt another wave of panic wash over me as I pictured the rest of my life crammed into this tiny space, and I bit my lip hard to get it under control. "It ain't much, but it's home," said Carl, pushing me out of the way and leaping onto the top bunk. "And this one's mine." I sat down on the lower bed and stared out of the bars, which made up one whole wall of the cell. All I could see on the other side of the giant pit were more cells and more prisoners, their gray faces a reflection of my own. I thought about just running out of the cell and jumping over the balcony ahead, 6 floors up and a hard rock below. 3 or 4 seconds and it would all be over. But there was no way. I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not yet, anyway. "6 floors isn't enough," came a voice above me, deep but surprisingly tuneful. I raised an eyebrow, wondering if he'd been reading my mind. "It's okay. It's the first thing any of us think about, and I've seen people do it, too. Jump from pretty much every level. Well, the ones that are open, anyway. First couple of floors, you get sprained ankles and a few bruises. Levels 3 through 6, you get broken up pretty badly, but you don't die. Not unless you hit head first, which isn't easy. You really want to bite the dust? Then you gotta go up. Level 7 or 8. That ought to do it." I heard the bed creak and shake as he changed position. "Funny thing is," he went on, "you go any higher, then you don't die either. I saw one kid go from the 10th floor, but he just bounced and screamed. Died a bit later, yeah, but I don't want to know what he went through first." I shuddered at the thought and promised myself I'd never jump, no matter how bad things got. The bed creaked again and a head appeared from over the top bunk. I was surprised to see it smiling. "Name is Donovan," he said. "Always thought it sounded better than Carl. You're Sawyer, right?" "Alex," I replied, not quite ready to abandon my first name. "Alex, right." He sprang from the bunk and landed gracefully on the cell floor before sitting next to me and looking me up and down. "You seem like a good kid. Anyway, you have to be careful around here. You get some real nasty freaks. Killers, you know." He laughed. "Well, we're all killers, but there are 2 kinds. The ones who did it for fun and the ones who did it because they had no choice." "And the ones who didn't do it," I added with a sad smile. "Yeah, we've been getting a few of them around here lately." I poked my flat pillow mournfully and lifted the sheet. It was so thin I could see right through it, like greaseproof paper. Not that I thought I'd get cold. The air in here was hot and heavy, like we were sitting in an oven. "Have you been here long?" I asked. He gave a kind of spluttered laugh that had absolutely no humor in it. 5 years, Alex. I'm first generation. I'd already been in prison for a couple of months, miles away from here. Geez, that place was nice. Spacious cells, leisure facilities, rec room. It was like a country club compared to this. They transferred everyone under 18 to Furnace as soon as it opened, so that all you other kids could see what happened when you did bad things. "But you were framed, right? By the men in black?" "Me? No." He paused for a minute, looking out through the bars, but obviously miles away. "The black suits have framed a lot of people in here, but I'm as guilty as they come. I killed my mom's boyfriend because he was beating her up every night. Just couldn't take it anymore. I snapped, hit him with a candlestick. Was a lucky hit, I guess, for an 11-year-old. Or unlucky, depending on how you look at it." "And they put you away?" I asked incredulously. "New laws had just come in, the ones clamping down on youth crime. That was the year of all the murders, the summer of slaughter, as everyone calls it. Even though I had nothing to do with the gangs, the government was using all cases of juvie murders as warnings, so they gave me life. The irony is, my mom, well, she couldn't handle it. He stopped and looked away, and I swear I could feel his rage like some kind of force emanating from him. How do you tell the time in here anyway? I asked, trying to change the subject. No sun, no clocks? You can't, he replied, obviously glad for the new topic of conversation. You just go by the sirens and by lockdown at the end of the day. Rhythms here are completely different, but you get used to them. He got up and walked to the cell door. On that note, let me show you around. I could do with some grub, and it's trough time soon. I pushed myself up off the bed, but not before noticing a series of gashes that ran along the wall. 5 lines etched into the rock from the bed to the door. He saw me looking at them and frowned. You'll get to know all about that soon enough, he whispered. What are they? They look like they were made by fingernails. I was joking, but from the way his expression hardened, I realized it was true. This place isn't right, he went on, leaning into me, so close I could feel his spit on my face. You're never safe here because one day it will be your turn to be taken. Maybe a week, maybe years, maybe tonight. Some go quietly, some don't. Adam didn't. He went screaming and clawing at the wall and fighting for his life. He ran his finger along one of the grooves, then he turned his attention back to me. In the dead of the night they come for you, Alex, he said. Sooner or later, they come for everyone. The goosebumps stayed on my arms all the way down the stairs as I fired question after question at Donovan's back. But now that we were out of the cell, his air of hard indifference had returned and he ignored me. He only started talking again as we were walking across the courtyard, but the smile was nowhere to be seen. Social distancing gone wrong. True. Sorry about the Jekyll and Hyde act, kid, he said through a mouth of stone, his eyes glaring hard at everyone we passed. In this place you gotta act tough all the time or else they pick you off. When I asked who they were, he nodded at the group of boys in the corner wearing the black bandanas. Kevin was there, but Montgomery, the fat kid, was nowhere to be seen. The pirates? I asked. Donovan made a noise from his nose that I thought might have been a laugh. Yeah, the pirates, otherwise known as the Skulls. They were one of the groups responsible for the slaughter. They're not the only gang here, but they're easily the worst. They all carry shanks. He noticed my confusion. Homemade knives. They made them out of anything and everything they can find. Rock, cutlery, even bone. Not afraid to use them either. We had crossed the courtyard and arrived at a large crack in the rock that led into a tunnel. Like everything else, it blended into the red walls perfectly, which was why I hadn't spotted it before. There were 2 more wall-mounted machine guns here, one pointing right at us, and one directed through the opening. Ignoring them, Donovan strode forward. Give the gangs a wide berth if you want to stay in one piece, he went on, as we made our way through the tunnel. Around here, the guards don't give a crap if we kill each other, and those kids don't have anything to lose. It's not like their sentence can get any longer if they kill anyone else, if you follow me. I did, although I couldn't quite believe what I was hearing. So, is that one who comes at night? The gangs? So is that who comes at night? Oh, to drag you away. This time Donovan laughed out loud, the sound echoing off the walls and making me jump. He simply shook his head and walked on, leading me out into another chamber of bare rock. This one was full of tables and benches, most of which were currently empty. At the far end of the room was a deserted canteen, not unlike the one at school. The ceiling here was much lower, bearing down on me as we walked toward the nearest table. The fleshy walls made me feel like I was in the stomach of some giant monster, a place to get digested, not to eat. Welcome to the trough room, he said. This is where you get your 3 tasty, nutritious meals of the day. Steak, salmon, venison, champagne truffle, the works. Seriously? I asked, a flicker of hope igniting inside me like a drug. Sure, I guess. Trouble is, you can never be too sure what you're getting because it's blended up with about a ton of sawdust and served as a paste. I like to think that what we were eating used to be real food. The flicker died, along with my appetite. We took seats opposite one another as the prisoners slowly made their way into the canteen, where the food was served. A few minutes later, 2 short bursts of the siren sounded and the crowd inside the canteen started to swell. "How did you know what time it was?" I asked as the door behind the canteen opened and a sweaty inmate emerged struggling to hold a vast container. "Like I said, you just get a knack for it," Donovan replied. He got to his feet and started walking toward the canteen. I made to follow, but he waved for me to sit back down again, shouting over his shoulder, "Allow me." I watched him go. The inmates were all hovering around the canteen, but there was no queue. Not that I really expected one in a place like this. It was more like vultures picking at a corpse. The strong ones got priority, barging past everyone else to be served first. I don't know whether it was a relief or a shock to see Donovan plow his way to the front, the smaller kids backing away from him and hovering on the outside of the throng. But even he stood to one side to let the skulls through, never taking his eyes off them as they snatched their food and walked away. I was distracted from the spectacle by a gentle hand on my shoulder and swung my head around to see Z. He sat down on the bench beside me and leaned in close, his face twisted in panic. "This place is like a death camp," he whispered. "What with the gangs and the guns and those scary guards?" "The black suits," I said. Z shuddered. "I've even got bloodstains on the floor of my cell, for Christ's sake." I thought about the marks on my wall, but didn't say anything. "What's your guy like? Carl?" "Donovan," I answered, watching him across the floor with 2 trays of food. "Nice. I was lucky, I think. What about you?" "Yeah, okay. Quiet kid. Wouldn't say boo to a goose, as my gran used to say." "I don't blame him," I answered. "I once got chased around by a park by a goose. I could swear it was trying to break my arm. They're evil." We were both giggling when Donovan arrived back, and he looked at us as if we were crazy. "It usually takes a few weeks for people to crack up in here," he said as he sat down, sliding my tray across the table. "Don't tell me you two have lost it already." "Donovan, this is Z." They nodded at each other, although both remained wary. "Another new fish," said Donovan, shoveling his food into his mouth. "I'd get it while it's hot if I were you. Not that this crap is hot." I looked at the mound of gray mush in front of me and instantly thought about the mess I'd made on the prison bus. They looked alike, and the smell wasn't too dissimilar either. It felt like my stomach was tying itself in knots, and I pushed the tray toward Z. "Help yourself," I said, but he had turned green at the sight of the food and looked like he was on the verge of chundering as well. Donovan's eyes were twinkling with affectionate humor. "A few more days and this will seem like heavenly macaroni and cheese," he said, pulling the tray toward him. "It's surprising what you can get used to when you're starving." That sounds disgusting. Thanks for listening. If you're new to my channel, my name is Jubilee. I'm a reading streamer over at Twitch. If you've enjoyed this reading, please follow me there to get a notification of when I'm going live. You'll find all of my links to my socials in the description box below. My normal streams are on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Thursday nights starting at 8 p.m. Central Standard Time. And if there are any other dates or times announced, they are going to be in my Discord. Thank you again for listening, and be blessed.